It is 6 p.m. here in Cairo, time for the news bulletin, and we will be starting straight away with the main headlines. President Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi performs the Fajr prayers at the newly inaugurated Al-Aziz Al-Hakim Mosque in Muqattam. Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati holds a number of phone calls on bilateral ties and regional issues. And the United States President Donald Trump says he supports the transitional Palestinian panel in Gaza. President Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi performed the Fajr prayers at the newly inaugurated Aziz Al-Hakim Mosque in Muqattam, marking the official opening of the integrated religious and community complex. Accompanied by Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli and senior state officials, the President inspected the facility, which includes the event halls, a Quranic nursery, and the medical clinic designed to serve the local residents. Following the prayers, Dr. Osama Al-Azhari, the Minister of Endowments, delivered a sermon commemorating Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, highlighting the spiritual lessons of the miracle and the mosque's role in the Ministry of Endowments' nationwide plan to modernize the religious infrastructure. Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati affirmed the Egyptian support for Lebanon and its respect for the Lebanese unity and territorial integrity, as well as the extension of the Lebanese state control over its territory. This came during a phone call between Abdulati and the Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salim. Foreign Minister Abdulati stressed the Egyptian support for the Lebanese national institutions to assume the full responsibilities, praising the announcement of the completion of the first phase of the weapons control plan in the state south of the Litani River. Abdulati also asserted the necessity of the full and non-selective implementation of the Security Council resolution, which guarantees the immediate and complete withdrawal of the Israeli occupation forces and stop the violations against the Lebanese sovereignty. Minister of Foreign Affairs Badr Abdulati received a phone call from the European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas and Cyprus's Foreign Minister Konstantinos Kambos. The phone call touched on enhancing the partnerships between Egypt and the European Union, particularly after the convention of the first Egyptian-European summit in Brussels, which crowned the promoted bilateral ties on the political, economic and security levels. The conversation also tackled the unfolding regional conditions, including in Iran and the occupied Palestinian territories, with the two sides agreeing on diffusing tensions to prevent the region from sliding into chaos and instability, while ruling any military options to regional crises. Minister of Foreign Affairs Badr Abdulati discussed the latest developments in Gaza with the U.S. President Donald Trump's Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in a phone call. The two sides discussed the stepped-up efforts for moving to the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal, including the powers of the Palestinian Technocrat Committee, once formed, and the deployment of the International Stabilization Force to monitor the ceasefire implementation. The phone call also touched on the escalation in Iran, with both officials agreeing on paving the way to peaceful settlements and support for regional security and stability. Witkoff hailed the Egyptian pivotal role in regional crises and extended the appreciation for President Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi over his keenness on maintaining the strategic partnership with his country. The U.S. President Donald Trump announced the formation of a Gaza Board of Peace. Trump said that he was backing the newly appointed Palestinian technocratic government in Gaza, where Washington has announced the launch of the second phase in a ceasefire that went into effect in October. The board's creation comes shortly after the announcement of the 15-member Palestinian Technocratic Committee. The committee will work under the supervision of the Board of Peace, which Trump said that he will lead as its chair. The Palestinian Technocratic body will have 15 members and will be led by Ali Shaath, a former deputy minister in the Palestinian Authority who had been in charge of developing the industrial zones. At least 6 Palestinians, including a child, were killed and others wounded when the Israeli occupation forces bombed 2 houses in Deir al-Balah in the central Gaza Strip. The Palestinian news agency Watha said last night that the Israeli forces targeted a house in Deir al-Balah refugee camp west of the city with missiles, and that the Israeli warplanes also bombed another house in the western part of Deir al-Balah city. An Israeli strike on South Lebanon killed 1 person a day after raids that Israel said had targeted Hezbollah, as Israel has kept up the regular strikes in Lebanon despite the 2024 ceasefire that sought to end more than a year of hostilities with Hezbollah, usually saying that it is targeting the members of the group or its infrastructure. In a statement, the Lebanese Health Ministry said an Israeli enemy strike on a vehicle in Mansouri in South Lebanon killed 1 person. The Prime Minister of Yemen has been replaced by the Foreign Minister after the Premier submitted the government's resignation. Prime Minister Salim Saleh bin Buraik met the Presidential Leadership Council Chairman Rashad Al-Alimi and submitted the government's resignation to pave the way for the formation of a new government. The Presidential Council posted on state media that the Foreign Minister Shaya Mohsen Zindani is appointed Prime Minister and tasked with forming the government. The statement published on Sabah cited the efforts to restore state institutions, strengthen the unity of sovereign decision-making, and defeating the coup as reasons for the Prime Minister's resignation. New Zealand said that it has temporarily closed the embassy in Tehran and flown out the diplomats because of the worsening security in Iran. A spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry said that the diplomatic staff left Iran safely on the commercial flights overnight. The Tehran embassy's operations were moved to Ankara, Turkey, because of the deteriorating security situation in Iran. The Foreign Ministry said that it had an extremely limited ability to give consular help to New Zealanders in Iran. Russian President Vladimir Putin held phone calls with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian in a bid to cool the tensions between the 2 rivals. The Kremlin said that the call was offering mediation amid large-scale protests in Iran that have raised the fears of a military confrontation in the region. The Kremlin said that it considered calls by some European states to resume the dialogue with Russia as positive after some European leaders called for re-engagement with Russia on Ukraine. The details follow.
The Kremlin said on Friday that it is preparing to welcome U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner to Moscow for peace talks on Ukraine, but that no dates have been set yet. The Kremlin hailed what it said looked like the desire of Italy, France, and Germany to resume dialogue on Ukraine with Russia as a significant shift which matched its own view of how the situation should evolve. British Foreign Minister Yvette Cooper has signaled London does not agree that the time is right to re-engage, however, saying that she had seen no evidence that Moscow wants peace in Ukraine. Moscow had an ongoing dialogue with the United States about so far unsuccessful efforts to get a peace deal in Ukraine, but no such dialogue currently existed with European governments. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said earlier this month that Europe should restart a dialogue with Russia to try to win more influence in negotiations over Ukraine, saying the EU should appoint an envoy to deal directly with President Vladimir Putin. French President Emmanuel Macron has also spoken of the possibility of re-engaging, talking in December of the necessity for a fulsome dialogue with Moscow within weeks if a robust and lasting peace for Ukraine was not reached in the meantime. On Thursday, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called Russia a European country, saying he hoped ties between the EU and Moscow could be rebalanced.
Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado gave the Nobel Peace Prize medal to the U.S. President Donald Trump during a White House meeting in a bid to influence the efforts to shape her country's political future. A White House official confirmed that Trump intends to keep the medal. In a social media post, Trump wrote, "Maria presented me with the Nobel Peace Prize for the work I have done. Such a wonderful gesture of mutual respect. Thank you, Maria." Machado, who described the meeting as excellent, said the gift was in recognition of what she called his commitment to the freedom of the Venezuelan people. A South Korean court sentenced the former President Yoon Suk-yeol to 5 years in prison on charges that included obstructing attempts by the authorities to arrest him following his failed bid to impose the martial law in December of 2024. The Seoul Central District Court found Yoon guilty of mobilizing the Presidential Security Service to block the authorities from executing an arrest warrant that had been legally issued by the court to investigate him for his martial law declaration. He was also found guilty of charges that included fabricating official documents and failing to comply with the legal process required for the martial law. He could face the death sentence in a separate trial on a charge of masterminding the insurrection by declaring martial law without jurisdiction. Shares slipped in Europe after a mixed session in Asia while the U.S. futures edged higher. The oil prices rebounded after dropping sharply on Thursday. Germany's DAX edged 0.1% lower, while the CAC 40 in Paris gave up 0.4%. Britain's FTSE 100 inched up 0.1%. The future for the S&P 500 added 0.3%, while that for the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 0.1%. Gains in Asia were led by Taiwan, where the benchmark rose nearly 2%. In Tokyo, the Nikkei 225 shed 0.3%, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng gave up 0.3%. The Shanghai Composite Index lost 0.3%. Elsewhere in Asia, South Korea's Kospi rose 0.9%. In Australia, the S&P ASX 200 gained 0.5%, and India's Sensex rose 0.2%. And the yen rallied against the dollar after Japan's finance minister floated the possibility of joint intervention with the United States to defend the nation's faltering currency. The dollar-yen rate jolted 0.4% lower to just below the 158 level after the latest comments on potentially stepping up into the market. The yen strengthened 0.3% to 158.37 per dollar, still poised for the 0.3% decline on the week. The dollar index, which measures the greenback against the basket of currencies, was little changed at 99.34 and on track for the 0.2% advance this week. The euro was steady at $1.1606, while the sterling edged up slightly to $1.3381. And this brings us to the end of the news bulletin for today. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.